Welcome back to our discussion of the beginnings of the Cold War from 1945 to 1952. In this second half of the lecture, we'll just be looking at the Korean War and McCarthyism. So this would be a much shorter and more focused lecture than the first half. Now, the Korean War from 1950 to 1953 is often referred to as the Forgotten War. Many people forget it even happened. And in fact, in the previous textbook we used in the course, it was barely mentioned. It was a war, however, which 33,000 American soldiers were killed, 2 million South Koreans, and an estimated 3 million North Koreans and Chinese. So a tremendous death toll. And it also became very, very symbolic of the Cold War. So let's look at the roots quickly of the Korean War. Korea was divided at the end of World War II. The Soviets were in the northern half of Korea, and the United States had forces in the southern half. So when the war ended in the Pacific, it was decided that there were two countries established on the peninsula of Korea: the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the DPRK in the northern half of the peninsula, and the Republic of Korea, or often referred to as South Korea, in the southern half. This is the situation today. The Korean Peninsula is still divided into two separate countries. So after the Korean Peninsula was divided up, both Soviet and American troops left the peninsula. In 1950, however, North Korean troops, with the encouragement of the Soviet Union and China, which by now, as you recall, was communist, invaded South Korea. And this was really a surprise invasion. Everybody was taken by surprise in South Korea. This was one sovereign country invading another country. The issue was brought up by the Security Council of the United Nations, which was set up precisely to keep world peace. And the Security Council voted and asked UN members to provide assistance, either troops or materiel, to help South Korea repel the armed attack. Now, it's important to remember that the UN Security Council, which then and now has 5 permanent members, one of which is the Soviet Union, they would have obviously blocked this resolution if they had been there, because they had encouraged North Korea to attack. But by coincidence, they were boycotting meetings of the UN Security Council over another issue, and so the vote was quickly taken without the Soviets being able to block it. So the net result was the United Nations sent military forces in from many, many countries. So let's look at a map for a moment. We have on the left the Korean Peninsula in 1950, just when the war started. And then we have the next 3 years on the right. And you can see on the right there, on the left rather, north of Korea is China, which by 1950 had been taken over by Mao Zedong and the communists, so it was communist China, and it's north of the Yalu River. The dotted line right in the middle of the map is the 38th parallel. It's the 38th degree north from the equator. It's referred to as the 38th parallel. This had been conveniently used at the end of World War II, when, as I mentioned before, Korea was divided in half, with North Korea, or the People's Democratic Republic of Korea, in the north, and South Korea in the southern half. And North Korea invaded, made quick advances, and it also had the assistance of active duty Chinese military. Some 300,000 Chinese troops actually went into Korea and helped invade South Korea. So very quickly, you had a massive retreat, and you see in the lower right-hand part of the map on the left, in dark green, that's where the United Nations forces, which consisted of South Korea, the United States, and about 50 other countries, had retreated to near the country of Pusan. And they very much feared that they would be totally defeated. Then you look on the map on the right, you can see, however, the UN forces managed to push north and out of their enclave near Pusan. And you can see an arrow going from Pusan around, and that was General Douglas MacArthur in September 1950, led a landing. He used naval craft and landed near Incheon, up near the capital, South Korean capital of Seoul. Was very successful, got behind the North Korean lines, and they started moving up. And in fact, within a few months, by November 1950, you can see the dashed line there. They had almost reached the Chinese border. And at that point, General MacArthur went public and urged that the U.S. and the United Nations, and if necessary just the U.S., actually cross the Yalu River and enter into China to defeat the Chinese. And it was one thing for him as the military commander to give that advice privately, but he went public with it. And the net result was he was fired. President Truman said, then as now, the President of the United States is the commander-in-chief of all U.S. military forces, and he would simply not accept one of his commanders going public with such a statement. And it was very, very reckless, I think, of MacArthur, because if he had gone into China, by this time, China had nuclear weapons, recall in 1949, and the Chinese may well have used one of their few bombs to protect their country. So, just to recap, China sent almost 250,000 troops and part of the invasion of South Korea. The United Nations responded with 3 million troops. About 2 million of those were South Koreans, and then there were troops from 58 other nations. The United States sent many troops, and the U.S. was in operational command. The United Nations agreed that the United States is by far the most powerful military. Under General Douglas MacArthur would be in command of the United Nations forces. So here we have the United Nations actually working to counter aggression. Well, there was finally a ceasefire agreement, and the agreement was to go to the status quo before the war. In other words, they went back to the 38th parallel, and that's the way it is today. North of that is North Korea, a communist regime with total dictatorship, not recognized by the United States. And below that, you have the Republic of Korea, the South, referred to as the South Korean government, which is a very, very wealthy Asian country now with a democratic system of government. So I put in red, let's just look at the legacy. Why do we care about the Korean War? Well, for Americans at the time, the North Korean attack was absolute proof that there was an international communist conspiracy and that the Soviets, and with them the Chinese, wanted to control the world. And what more could you see than they had invaded South Korea? Another legacy, as I mentioned a moment ago, was President Truman fired General Douglas MacArthur, who had been a famous hero in World War II, when MacArthur publicly disagreed on extending the war into China. So MacArthur went back to the United States. He resigned, and he made a speech before Congress because he was such a hero, in which he said the famous lines about this old soldier will now retire and fade into history. And as I put in red here, this confirms civilian control of the U.S. military. And this is very, very fundamental since the beginning of the United States and continues to this very day, that the U.S. military is controlled by civilians. Not only is the president the commander in the chief, when you take the branches of the military, for instance, the Air Force, the Secretary of the Air Force, who is the top official in the Air Force, is a civilian, a member of the cabinet, Secretary of the Navy, etc., Secretary of Army, and then above them you have a civilian Secretary of Defense. So this is a principle of the United States with civilian control over the military. Now, the Korean War, with in 1950, as I mentioned, the North Korean attack on the South to take over the South, led to the White House, President Truman, sort of rethinking what should the U.S. policy be to counter Soviet and Chinese expansionism. And the National Security Council, you may or may not be familiar with that. That is still a very powerful body in the executive branch of the United States government. It's part of the White House, and it consists of advisors. They come from, many people. The people are rotated in from the Department of State or Department of Defense or CIA, and they look at national security issues and make recommendations. They try and help coordinate policies around the government. Well, they asked the National Security Council, Truman did, to come up with a proposal, and they came up with a famous Directive number 68. It's known bureaucratically as NSC 68. And there is a copy of this in the e-reader, which I've asked you to read. And this basically expanded the containment strategy laid out by George Kennan to include active military opposition to the Soviets or Chinese expanding, as they had by attacking South Korea. And again, you'll recall George Kennan's famous long telegram had suggested, let's just contain the Soviet Union. And that had been written before China became communist. Let's just keep them where they are. And now it was clear in Korea that the Soviet Union was expanding. There was a great fear it would happen elsewhere. And it led to a much more proactive policy that if the Chinese or the Soviets are expanding elsewhere in the world, the U.S. will take active military steps to counter that expansion. And this was fundamental basis of U.S. foreign policy until 1990, when 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. And of course, when we start looking at Vietnam, we'll see these are the very roots of the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Now, after the Korean War, there was a major increase in U.S. military forces, strong support among the public and, of course, in Congress. And more assistance was being given now to the French military, which for a number of years had been fighting a large communist independence movement in Southeast Asia in the French colony of Indochina. And French Indochina now includes countries of Laos, Cambodia, and of course Vietnam. So we start looking very shortly, of course, at the Vietnam War. We'll see U.S. involvement really started when the French were fighting the communist forces, independence forces in Indochina, and the U.S. provided massive military and economic assistance and technical assistance to the French. And also, in general, Americans now had a much more negative view of the Soviet Union and China. And now I'd like to just show you some, I think, interesting photographs from the period. So this is a brochure that was widely circulated. The red octopus, of course, you can see is the Soviet Union, and it has its tentacles reaching around the world, South America, Africa, Australia, you name it, the Soviet Union is spreading. This is a pamphlet, 5 cents at the time. It says, keep this pamphlet moving. In other words, read it, give it to your neighbor. And there we have the red octopus of the Soviet Union with a drawing of Joseph Stalin, above him the hammer and sickle, and the tentacles reaching throughout the world. This is just a close-up of that. And here we have the Russian bear. It's not a cute, friendly bear. It's a very aggressive bear. And you can see it's reaching out. On the far left, you can see Cuba, Europe, Africa. And U.S. policy for the next 45 years was really characterized in a number of U.S. military involvements throughout the world, fighting proxy forces of the Soviet Union in China. I mean, whether it's in Africa, Vietnam, you name it, Cuban Missile Crisis we'll see later in the course, et cetera, et cetera. This is a poster. If Russia should win, and it says in small print, if Russia and the communists should win the next world war, many American men would be sterilized. And then at the very bottom, it's a little hard to read, it says, in case the communists should conquer, our women would be helpless beneath the boots of the Asiatic Russians. And you see a poor woman about to be crushed by a boot. This is sort of reminiscent, you remember, of some of the posters we saw in World War I, where you had the boot of a German soldier, and this woman who's sort of scantily clad. Also, people would immediately think of the famous movie that came out, I think it was in the 1930s, King Kong, where you have the King Kong gorilla escapes and grabs a woman dressed like that and climbs up the side of the Empire State Building in New York. So here we have now not Russia, but we have China, communist China, again depicted as an octopus. The tentacle, or the arms of the octopus are reaching out all over Asia, and you see down at the bottom Indochina. That's French Indochina. In other words, that's Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, which we'll talk about a lot later. You see in the right, you can see Korea, the upper right-hand side, and then over the left, Tibet. Now, this is interesting. This is an advertisement for a company that makes sirens, and it says, when the bombers come. They're referring to bombers from the Soviet Union coming over to drop atomic bombs. And these sirens are air raid sirens, which were everywhere in the United States. They were in residential areas. They were every few blocks up on big poles. They were very, very, very loud. I remember hearing them as a kid. When they had tests, they obviously had them outside of every school. They had them in urban areas. And so when the sirens went off, unless it was a test, you were supposed to run into a shelter and, as I mentioned in the previous half of this lecture, tune in your radio to the emergency frequency. But it's interesting, it doesn't say if the bombers come. It says when. People were sort of assuming there would be a Russian attack. Now my students laugh at this photo, but I remember doing this. We had nuclear attack drills in school all the time. We would jump under the desk, cover our heads like this. If we were out in the playground, we would immediately fall down, put our hands above our head, curl up to be somewhat protected, supposedly, from the nuclear fallout. We also would, at least where I went to school when I was this age in Denver, Colorado, like once or twice a year, I remember we would all get in school buses, and we would go like an hour trip up to the mountains, and we would all go into caves, these huge, huge caves, which we all thought was great fun at the time, a day out of school, whatever. But, these caves were like massive air raid shelters to save the youth of America in the case of a nuclear attack. Now, in my face-to-face classes, students laugh at these photos, and I say, yeah, right now, students have drills for what? Shooters. We never had, when I was growing up, no one I know ever went into a school and shot up, No student or outsider went in like has happened here in the last 20 years or so. So we didn't have shooter drills. This was more of an atomic weapon coming. Another pamphlet, Communism, America's Mortal Enemy. The hand, again with the hammer and sickle of communism, striking the heartland of the United States. This is a pamphlet, and I found all these images on the internet. And this one, I honestly remember having seen when I was in school. It has threat to freedom, it has the hammer and sickle, it has a little church, and it has people, young men and women, like junior high school age, walking out of church. One thing you'll notice in terms of society, and I think it's fascinating to study how people lived, you'll notice that the girls all have dresses. And at this time, virtually, girls would always wear dresses. They wouldn't wear pants. And it was, considered very exotic for a woman to wear pants and not wear a skirt or a dress. And if you see old movies, you'll see the same thing. So finally, let's just turn quickly to McCarthyism. Senator McCarthy, Joseph McCarthy, was a Democratic senator. And he really exaggerated in the Senate and among the American people the response, the infiltration of the U.S. by Soviet spies. Now, remember in 1949, the Soviets had acquired nuclear weapons. And people said, well, that was because of Russian spies in the U.S. It's true, there were some Soviet spies who had facilitated the Soviet development. So there is some truth to this. And the Rosenbergs, a husband-wife spy team in New York City, had managed to acquire nuclear weapons secrets and pass them on to the Russians. And there had been a British communist working in the United States at the famous Los Alamos Research Facility in New Mexico, and he'd passed some secret nuclear information to the Soviets, which has speeded up their development of the first nuclear bomb. But what McCarthy did is he went farther along, and he claimed that there were spies virtually everywhere. He claimed that the State Department was full of Soviet spies, and that he had a list of such spies, which he never showed to anyone. He just held up a piece of paper. He also, and there was never a spy found in the federal government, a government employee. This was the same time, of course, that Congress, the House of Representatives, had the House Un-American Activities Committee, which looked for communist sympathizers, including among Hollywood actors. There was a feeling some of them may be communist sympathizers, even people like the famous comedian Lucille Ball. You may have seen the old I Love Lucy movies, the old reruns. She was accused of perhaps being a communist sympathizer, not a spy, but a sympathizer. Here we have a photo of Senator McCarthy standing up and claims this is a list of 200 spies in the State Department. He never actually He said the next page had the names. He never actually showed it to anyone. He was basically just making up all this. It was causing some hysteria at first, and then people thought he went too far when he started accusing the senior military generals in the U.S. government, in the U.S. Army and Navy, of being communist spies, and he didn't have any evidence. This is a photo that Senator McCarthy had taken, and he circulated it widely. And it shows him, obviously, with a brush, and what he said in his campaign material was, "Here I am sweeping clean the corruption and the spies, all the foreign spies in the U.S. government." Well, he damaged the reputations of many, many innocent people. Innocent people were fired from the government because McCarthy made some allegations. Finally, after his totally unfounded attacks on senior military generals, President Truman called him a pathological character assassin, and the U.S. Senate passed a resolution denouncing him for unprofessional and unethical behavior. Well, this leads to the conclusion of this section, and our next lecture will look at the 1950s in the U.S. We'll look at the Cold War, which will continue, obviously, but we'll also look at some of the economic developments, the culture in the U.S., and then we'll look at the very beginnings of the civil rights movement. Thank you.